It's easy to get the idea that a story in a big old collection of books is a neutral story, a timeless story, a safe story. It's easy to read the stories, to hear the stories, to even tell the stories to other people, as if these are stories about a set of unreal people from no fixed place, no fixed time, that these are neutral stories. But the stories I find in this collection of books that we call the Bible, are not neutral, faceless stories. This is not a timeless classic. It's not vague. It's not a fantasy set in a far-off place. It's not a set of general, universal truth stories or fables or morals. Instead, it's a set of down-to-earth stories about real people in real places and real times. And that's no clearer than in a book called Luke. Luke's story is a story. There's art in it. There's inspiration in it. But at its heart, it is a history. I don't need to read far in Luke's story to be reminded that his story about the life and the death and the resurrection of a man called Jesus, is a Jewish story. More than that, it's an ancient Near East story set about 2,000 years ago. It's a story about a place and a time and real people who are in an oppressed country facing life in an ancient empire, the Roman Empire, living in a country called Israel. So this is a story about actual people, a teenage girl and her husband-to-be. Neither of them Christian. This is not vague, and this is not a neutral story. So when they, Mary and Joseph, have a child, and they call him Jesus, or Yeshua as he would have been known to them, they then naturally follow their own Jewish traditions and rituals. So after 8 days they have him circumcised, and then later they go to the temple in Jerusalem, which is where all your religious rituals have to be done and performed. And there they go through rituals like the ritual that Mary has to go through after having given birth, and a ceremony of presenting your child, and in particular your firstborn son, at the temple. And around that there were rituals that had to be performed. Often you would pay a 5 shekel contribution or donation to the temple work as a sign of your firstborn. And beyond that, there were sacrifices that you would offer. It's so easy when we hear about Jesus all the time to remember that Jesus was Jewish, and that Luke's story about him is part of a much bigger story and a history. But Luke, the storyteller, reminds us of this Jewish story in just about every line as he uses stories and words and ideas from the Jewish scriptures. Luke lets us know that these new parents offer a pair of doves at the temple. Now, in the Jewish worship book, if you like, that lays out what happens at the temple in Leviticus, it says that 2 doves are an acceptable offering in this occasion only if you can't afford the actual offering. So Jesus' beginnings are among the poor. And it's interesting how many of God's stories are set amongst the poor. This is not an accident. This is not neutral. In Jewish tradition, in Jewish law, in their Torah as they knew it, any claim of any kind had to be verified. And it was verified by, it was laid down, it had to be verified by 2 witnesses. And so Luke tells us in his story of 2 people who are in the temple and now respond to this couple bringing their baby son. The city is their capital city. It's a big bustling city full of people. The temple is a huge operation, a huge building or set of buildings. So sometimes we might read this story and think that Simeon, who's mentioned, and later on somebody called Anna, are sitting in a small place waiting for people just to turn up. But that's not the case. They have a vast area that they could be in and all sorts of things that are going on. And yet they all appear together at this particular place at this particular time. A coincidence? Not in this kind of story. Luke, the storyteller, tells us then about Simeon. He says he was waiting for something called the consolation of Israel, or the comfort of Israel. This is a phrase that would have rung in his listeners' ears because it comes from something called their prophets, and in particular one of their prophets called Isaiah. They had all sorts of expectations as they faced up to life in the Roman Empire and that their land wasn't the way it was supposed to be. And these expectations were based on promises their God had given to them through inspired prophets in books like Isaiah, where it talks about comforting Israel in the future, a time that things would be put to rights. Now, their expectations were, well, this would mean a new king, a new warrior king who's going to smash the Romans and we can have our own empire. The Jesus story is going to turn that on its head. The Jewish people at this time actually believed that as much as they held on to these hopes in some way, the messages had actually stopped. It's about 400 years since any prophet had been inspired in the same way. Simeon then has been patient, waiting for the consolation, the comfort of Israel. Luke also wants us to know that something called the Holy Spirit is involved. He mentions it 3 times. In other words, that God's presence is here and God is at work. That despite the silence for 400 years, God is now speaking at work again. And what does Simeon do before he speaks? How does he respond to this baby and this poor couple? The first thing he does is to take the baby in his arms warmly and then starts to declare that God has fulfilled his promise. Now this is a repeating chorus, theme, a harmony, a hook that goes all the way through Luke, that this is a God who makes promises and this is a God who keeps promises. Here Simeon says, God has kept his promises. He promised to comfort Israel, to put things to rights, and I've been waiting patiently for it, and now I can rest. I can even die because I've seen this salvation, is the word he uses. Notice he doesn't say that he's seen what will happen in the future about this. He's seen it now, that somehow this baby in his arms is what God is doing and changes everything. But he doesn't stop. He keeps speaking, or maybe in fact singing. And it seems that he sees more than that. He's inspired, and Luke loves this theme. He's inspired to see more, that this God is about more, that the answer is not just the comfort of Israel, which is limited to the Jewish people, but it's beyond that God is bringing light to all nations, to not just the Jews, but to a group called the Gentiles. And that's just a word that means everybody else. This is a bigger story. This is a bigger promise than the Jews realized, yet it's something that God had always promised and they had forgotten. Luke likes lots of layers and lots of details. When he uses the word salvation, he's using a Greek word soterion, but behind that would have been a Hebrew word, and that Hebrew word would have been Yeshua. And the name given to Jesus is Yeshua. Luke tells us that Mary and Joseph then respond to hearing what Simeon has sung. It says they marvelled, or they were astounded at what Simeon had said, which is strange actually, because most of what he said is the kind of thing that the angels have already told them, and the angels have already told the shepherds, and the shepherds have already told them, so they shouldn't be surprised by that. But I want to wonder if what really astounds them is what he then goes on to say. And that is that this is not just good news. There's not just light, but there's a dark side to what Simeon is saying, because he talks about falling and rising. He talks about people speaking against what God is doing, and he talks about a sword piercing a soul. I keep saying that when I'm wrestling with these stories, that the power, the beauty in these writings isn't in the art and the craft. It's about the truth and the reality. That this is about real human beings, about mistakes, about confusion, about doubts, about joy but also about pain and about suffering. The light may always win, but the darkness is real. Luke is setting up Jesus' story here, even before he is more than a baby. That it's going to be a story about God who doesn't pretend that the darkness isn't real. A God who is prepared to do what has to be done to deal with everything that gets in the way. And a God whose project won't be warmly embraced by everyone in the same way this baby is. That there will be pushback, there will be opposition, that this story is not neutral. Remember I said the Jewish law preferred two witnesses. Well, here's the other witness, Anna. A bit of a surprise because in a Jewish story, this prophet, and she's known as a prophet, is a woman. Luke's first listeners would have found this a bit of a shock. 400 years of silence, and then here's someone declaring to be a prophet, and it's a woman. But those who wrestle with their scriptures properly know this shouldn't be a surprise, because Anna just joins a line of women in God's stories. People who acted and spoke for God like Miriam and Deborah and Huldah and Job's daughter and Judith and more. And the Jesus story again will turn these mistaken assumptions upside down. It's not neutral. Anna's inspiration is to respond in praise and to use words like the redemption of Israel. And again, this is just another way of Luke layering up the way that this is embedded in the Jewish story, as this is another line from the prophets and from Isaiah in 52 this time, that the redemption of Israel, the comfort and the redeeming, the freeing of God's people is what God is about. And this is God keeping his promises. And Anna gets to respond by praising and thanking God for what he is now doing. Her response is not neutral. Simeon's response is not neutral. Mary and Joseph's response is not neutral. This is not a neutral story. The story of the scriptures is not a story for neutrals. Jesus provokes, invites, demands. There's no ignoring. There's no choosing the middle ground. I noticed so far that by chapter 2, in this story there's a poor couple, there's a teenage girl, there's her husband-to-be, there's an elderly couple who then have a baby by surprise. There's some working shepherds, and now there's two elderly and faithful people who've been in service or around the temple who arguably are at the end of their useful service. It's so easy to treat these stories as neutral. It's so easy to discount maybe the youngest. What part could they possibly play? To discount the poorest. What could they have to offer? To discount the uneducated. How can they understand? To discount the elderly. What have they left? But in this story, in the Jesus story, in God's story, in God's project, everyone at every stage is part of what God is doing. God's at work. Jesus is at the centre of the story. But there's a part for every single person at whatever stage they are at, regardless of what they think of themselves, regardless of what society says about them. There's no being neutral. This demands our response. My response, I hope, is like Simeon's, to warmly take this into my arms, to see what God is doing and then to respond and try and respond. I wonder, I pray, what your response will be.